October 1941. German panzer forces drive deep into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa has been a stunning success. The Wehrmacht crushes Soviet armies, captures millions of prisoners, and advances hundreds of miles. German tank crews are confident, even arrogant. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs have proven superior to everything the Soviets can field. Then, near Mtsensk, they encounter something new. A German tank commander peers through his periscope. Soviet tanks are advancing. But these aren't the pathetic T-26s and BT-7s the Germans have been destroying by the hundreds. These are different. Low, sleek, with sloped armor and a large gun. The Germans open fire. Their shells bounce off. The Soviet tanks keep coming. They fire. German tanks explode. Panic spreads through the German ranks. What is this monster? The tank was the T-34, and it would change the war. German General Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist later called it the finest tank in the world. General Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote that the T-34 gave the Soviets a weapon superior to anything Germany possessed. Heinz Guderian, father of the Panzer forces, admitted the T-34's appearance was one of the greatest shocks of the entire war. This Soviet tank, designed by a team led by Mikhail Koshkin, would become the most produced tank in history and arguably the most influential armored vehicle ever built. This is the story of the T-34, a weapon born from brilliant engineering and Soviet industrial determination. It's about innovative design that prioritized the essentials and ignored the luxuries. It's about mass production on a scale never before achieved. Most importantly, it's about the tank that stopped the German advance, turned the tide on the Eastern Front, and helped crush Nazi Germany. The genesis: learning from failure. The Soviet Union entered the 1930s with outdated tank designs inherited from the 1920s. Soviet doctrine emphasized mobility and firepower, but the tanks themselves were crude, unreliable, and poorly armored. Soviet involvement in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 provided harsh lessons. Soviet tanks were vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. Armor was inadequate. Reliability was poor. The most important lesson came from the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where Soviet and Japanese forces clashed in Mongolia. Soviet BT-7 tanks, while fast, proved vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank guns. Soviet observers concluded that future tanks needed heavier armor, better guns, and improved reliability. Speed alone wasn't enough. Protection and firepower were equally critical. Mikhail Koshkin, chief designer at the Kharkov locomotive factory, led the design team that would create the T-34. Koshkin was a brilliant engineer, but also a survivor of Stalin's purges, understanding that failure could mean death. His team included Alexander Morozov and Nikolai Kucherenko, both excellent engineers. Together, they developed radical ideas about tank design. Their analysis was brutally pragmatic. What won tank battles? Firepower to kill enemy tanks, armor to survive enemy fire, mobility to maneuver and exploit breakthroughs, reliability to reach the battle and fight without breaking down. Everything else was secondary. Crew comfort, ease of operation, sophisticated optics, all the features Western tanks emphasized were luxuries the Soviets couldn't afford and didn't need. Revolutionary design choices. The T-34 incorporated several revolutionary features that, combined, created a superior tank. First, sloped armor. Instead of vertical armor plates, the T-34's hull and turret featured aggressive sloping. This wasn't a new concept, but the T-34 implemented it more thoroughly than any previous tank. Sloped armor provides two advantages. A sloped plate presents more effective thickness to an incoming shell, and shells are more likely to ricochet off sloped surfaces. The T-34's 45mm front armor, sloped at 60 degrees, provided protection equivalent to 90mm of vertical armor. This made the T-34 nearly invulnerable to most German anti-tank weapons in 1941-1942. Second, the Christie suspension. The T-34 used a suspension system designed by American inventor J.W. Christie. Large road wheels, mounted on independent vertical coil springs, provided excellent ride quality over rough terrain. This allowed higher speeds cross-country without breaking the tank or exhausting the crew. The suspension was simple, reliable, and maintainable. Third, wide tracks. The T-34's tracks were significantly wider than those on German tanks. This distributed the tank's weight over a larger area, reducing ground pressure. In the mud of the Rasputitsa, the spring and autumn seasons when Russian roads became impassable bogs, German tanks bogged down, while T-34s kept moving. In winter snow, the same advantage applied. This mobility advantage was decisive in the conditions where the battles were actually fought. Fourth, the diesel engine. Most tanks of the era used gasoline engines. The T-34 used a V2 diesel engine derived from aircraft engine designs. Diesel fuel was less flammable than gasoline, improving survivability when hit. Diesel engines were more fuel efficient, increasing operational range. The V2 produced 500 horsepower, giving the 26-ton T-34 excellent power-to-weight ratio and a top speed of 35 miles per hour, faster than most German tanks. Fifth, the 72.6mm gun. The T-34's main armament was substantially more powerful than guns on German Panzer III and early Panzer IV tanks. The 72.6mm gun could penetrate any German tank's armor at normal combat ranges in 1941-1942. It fired high explosive shells that were devastating against soft targets and armor-piercing shells that could kill tanks. The gun was powerful, reliable, and relatively easy to manufacture.
The price of simplicity. However, these strengths came with significant drawbacks that wouldn't have been acceptable to Western tank designers. The T-34 was crude in ways that horrified German and American engineers who examined captured examples. The interior was cramped and uncomfortable. The crew of 4, driver, bow machine gunner, commander, and gunner/loader, had minimal space. The commander served dual roles, commanding the tank and commanding the gun crew, an overwhelming workload in combat. German tanks had 5-man crews with dedicated commanders, allowing better tactical coordination. The optics were terrible. Vision devices were crude, small, and provided poor visibility. The commander had minimal situational awareness. German tank commanders, standing in their turrets with excellent visibility, could spot and engage targets before Soviet crews even saw them. This advantage partially offset the T-34's superior armor and gun. The transmission was difficult to operate. Changing gears required tremendous physical strength and skill. Some gears could only be engaged by using a large mallet to hammer the gear lever into position. Driver training took months because the transmission was so challenging to master. Many transmissions failed in combat from abuse by desperate drivers trying to maneuver under fire. The finish quality was atrocious by Western standards. Welds were crude. Surfaces were rough. Parts didn't fit precisely. Components were literally hammered into place during assembly. German engineers examining captured T-34s were appalled by the poor workmanship, yet the tanks worked. They fought. They won. This reflected Soviet design philosophy. Build weapons that worked adequately, in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the enemy. Don't waste time on refinement or crew comfort. Get functional tanks to the front quickly. This approach, while brutal for crews, was strategically brilliant given Soviet industrial capabilities and the desperate situation in 1941-1942. Production under impossible conditions. T-34 production began in 1940 at the Kharkiv locomotive factory. Initial production was slow, with quality control issues and design refinements. By June 1941, when Germany invaded, the Soviets had produced about 1,200 T-34s. This seems substantial, but they were scattered across the vast Soviet Union, often with poorly trained crews, inadequate spare parts, and tactical doctrine that didn't yet understand how to employ them effectively. The German invasion created catastrophe. Within months, the Kharkiv factory was threatened by German advance. In one of history's most remarkable industrial achievements, the entire factory was dismantled, loaded onto trains, and evacuated eastward to the Urals. Workers, machinery, everything moved over 1,000 miles while fighting raged. At the new location in Nizhny Tagil, in freezing winter conditions, workers reassembled the factory. Many worked outdoors in sub-zero temperatures. They lived in tents and dugouts. Food was scarce. People died from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Yet, tank production resumed within weeks. By early 1942, T-34s were rolling off assembly lines again. Multiple factories began T-34 production. Simplified manufacturing processes increased output. Quality decreased as desperate measures maximized quantity. Some T-34s were driven directly from the factory to the front line, unpainted, with factory workers manning the guns because no trained crews were available. They fought in their first battle with only a few hours of crew training. By 1942, the Soviets were producing over 1,000 T-34s monthly. By 1943, production exceeded 1,300 monthly. For comparison, Germany's peak tank production was under 400 monthly of all types combined. The Soviets were producing T-34s faster than the Germans could destroy them. The production advantage was decisive. Combat evolution, the T-34-85. By 1943, the T-34's advantages were diminishing. Germany introduced Tiger and Panther tanks with powerful guns that could defeat T-34 armor at long range. The 76.2 mm gun struggled against these new tanks' thick armor. Soviet designers needed an answer. The solution was the T-34-85, featuring a three-man turret mounting an 85 mm gun. The larger turret allowed a dedicated commander, finally addressing one of the T-34's critical weaknesses. The 85 mm gun could penetrate Tiger and Panther armor at reasonable ranges. Better optics improved targeting. The transmission received improvements, making it slightly less brutal to operate. The T-34-85 entered production in early 1944. It was essentially a new tank using the proven T-34 chassis and engine. Production transitioned smoothly because most components were unchanged. By mid-1944, all T-34 production was the 85 variant. The T-34-85 was competitive with German tanks again, though still inferior to late-war German designs in many respects. However, the Soviets produced T-34-85s by the thousands, while Germany's tank production collapsed under Allied bombing and resource shortages. Quantity triumphed over quality. Tactical employment. Soviet tactical doctrine evolved dramatically during the war. Early use of T-34s was often wasteful, with poorly coordinated attacks and inadequate infantry support. German anti-tank guns destroyed T-34s in large numbers despite the tank's superiority because Soviet tactics were primitive. By 1943-1944, Soviet doctrine had matured. Tank armies, massive formations of thousands of tanks, executed sophisticated deep operations, breaking through German lines and exploiting far into the rear. The T-34's reliability and range allowed these operations. German tanks, often more powerful individually, couldn't match the strategic mobility and sustainability of massed T-34 formations. The T-34 excelled in the type of warfare the Eastern Front demanded: long advances over rough terrain, fighting in mud and snow, operating with minimal maintenance and supply, shock assaults on fortified positions. The T-34 could do all of this adequately. German tanks, often superior in direct combat, couldn't sustain operations under Eastern Front conditions the way T-34s could. Soviet crews developed their own tactics to offset the T-34's weaknesses. They used superior numbers, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. They accepted heavy casualties, understanding that losing 3 T-34s to kill 1 Tiger was acceptable when you had dozens more T-34s and the Germans had no replacement Tigers. This brutal calculus reflected Soviet reality. They could afford losses, Germany couldn't. The drive to Berlin. From 1943 to 1945, T-34s spearheaded every major Soviet offensive. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 saw thousands of T-34s in the largest tank battle in history. The liberation of Ukraine, Operation Bagration in Belarus, the Vistula-Oder offensive, all were executed by tank armies dominated by T-34s. The final assault on Berlin in April-May 1945 involved thousands of T-34s fighting street battles in the rubble of the Nazi capital. The T-34, designed for open warfare, adapted to urban combat. Tank crews learned to support infantry in building-to-building fighting. They provided direct fire support against fortifications. They reduced German strongpoints that would have cost thousands of infantry casualties. When the war ended, the Soviet Union had produced over 57,000 T-34 tanks of all variants. This was more than all German tank production combined throughout the war. The T-34 represented the decisive weapon on the Eastern Front, where most of World War II's European fighting occurred. It wasn't the best tank, it was the good enough tank produced in overwhelming numbers. Post-war service and exports. The T-34's service didn't end in 1945. Soviet satellite states received thousands of T-34s. The tank fought in the Korean War on the North Korean side, shocking American forces who had to quickly deploy heavier tanks to counter it. Chinese forces used T-34s extensively. Every Soviet-aligned nation received T-34s. The tank appeared in conflicts worldwide for decades. The Arab-Israeli wars, Vietnam, African conflicts, Latin American insurgencies, and countless others saw T-34s in action. Some nations operated T-34s into the 1990s. The design's simplicity and reliability meant even nations with minimal maintenance capabilities could keep them running. Total production, including all variants and post-war manufacture in Czechoslovakia and Poland, exceeded 84,000 tanks. This makes the T-34 the second most produced tank in history, surpassed only by its successor, the T-54-55. No other single tank design influenced armored warfare as profoundly or served as widely. Comparing to other tanks, how does the T-34 compare to its contemporaries and its legacy? The German Panther, often called the best tank of World War II, was superior to the T-34 in many ways. It had better armor, a better gun, better optics, and better crew ergonomics. However, it was complex, expensive, and unreliable. Germany produced about 6,000 Panthers. The Soviet Union produced 10 times as many T-34s. On a battlefield where one Panther faced 5 T-34s, the Panther's individual superiority mattered little. The American M4 Sherman was produced in comparable numbers to the T-34, about 50,000 units. The Sherman was more comfortable, more reliable mechanically, and easier to operate. American crew survival rates were better. However, the Sherman was undergunned and under-armored compared to the T-34. In direct combat, the T-34 had advantages. The Sherman's strengths lay in reliability and operational sustainability. The British Churchill and Cromwell tanks were solid designs but produced in much smaller numbers. They never achieved the T-34's impact because Britain couldn't match Soviet production scale, and the British tanks didn't fight on the same scale of continuous combat that the Eastern Front demanded. The drive to the designer's fate. Mikhail Koshkin, the T-34's chief designer, never saw his creation's full triumph. During winter testing in 1940, Koshkin personally drove a T-34 prototype from Kharkov to Moscow and back, demonstrating the tank to military authorities. The journey in harsh winter conditions damaged Koshkin's health. He developed pneumonia that progressed to tuberculosis. He died in September 1940, only aged 42. Koshkin's death meant he never saw the T-34 stopping the German invasion, never saw the production achieved, never knew his design would become the most influential tank in history. His colleagues continued his work, refining and improving the design, but the fundamental brilliance was Koshkin's. He created a weapon that saved his nation, dying before he could see it succeed. Legacy and historical assessment. The T-34 represents a specific philosophy of weapon design. Good enough in overwhelming numbers wins wars. It wasn't the best tank in any single category. German and some American tanks were better in various ways. But the T-34 combined good enough performance in all critical areas with producibility and reliability. The sloped armor influenced all future tank designs. Every modern tank uses sloped armor. The concept of mobility, firepower, and protection in balance became doctrine. The idea that crew comfort and operational refinement could be sacrificed for production efficiency influenced Soviet military design for decades. The T-34 proved that industrial capacity was as important as technical sophistication. Germany produced technically superior tanks, but couldn't produce enough of them. The Soviet Union produced adequate tanks in such numbers that technical inferiority didn't matter strategically. This lesson influenced Cold War military planning, with both sides emphasizing production capacity and sustainability. The T-34 was the right tank at the right time, produced by the right nation. It matched Soviet industrial capabilities, military doctrine, and strategic needs perfectly. It was crude but effective. It was uncomfortable but reliable. It was simple but deadly. It was everything a Soviet tank needed to be in 1941-1945. Over 84,000 were built. They fought on every continent. They served for over 50 years in some armies. They influenced every tank designed afterward. They stopped the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, turned the tide at Kursk, and drove to Berlin. Without the T-34, Soviet victory would have been impossible. Without Soviet victory on the Eastern Front, defeating Nazi Germany would have cost far more lives and taken far longer. The T-34 wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of Soviet resistance, of industrial determination, of the triumph of good enough weapons produced in overwhelming quantities. It represented a design philosophy that prioritized essentials over refinement, quantity over quality, and strategic effect over tactical perfection. For the Soviet tankers who crewed them, the T-34 was a tough, reliable companion that brought them through the war. For the Germans who faced them, the T-34 was a nightmare, appearing in endless numbers, impossible to stop. For history, the T-34 was the tank that saved Russia and helped crush Nazi Germany. It was, quite simply, one of the most important weapons ever built.